and particularly with a focus on how parent centers can assist and support parents who have children who may have or have a suspected brain injury and are not seeing any symptoms or challenges related to it until after the actual injury may have occurred. So let's start with a little webinar etiquette. Right now, everyone's line is muted, and that's just to minimize the amount of noise that sometimes interrupts our presenters. However, if you do have a question or if you need assistance, feel free to use the chat box, because we do have a couple of folks from the SIPR team who are monitoring the chat box and can help you if you need assistance, or if you have a question, can bring the question to our group. And who didn't mute their line? Sounds like Deborah. Finally, there's a way for you to raise your hand, and there's a little icon at the top just under your toolbar where there's a person with a hand, and you can use that to raise your hand and let people know you have a question, or let us know if you're having a hard time hearing us. We're talking too fast, talking too slow. Please feel free to use that. Before we get started, we're going to have just a couple of comments from Carmen Sanchez, who is the OSEP project officer for the Center for Parent Information and Resources, as well as a number of parent centers across the country. Carmen, are you ready to join us?
Yes. Can you hear me, Deborah?
You are coming across loud and clear.
Great, thanks. I'm Carmen Sanchez. I'm the project officer for many of the parent centers throughout the country, and as Deborah said, the Center for Parent Information and Resources and 2 of the regional parent technical assistance centers. We had a series of webinars that were sort of disability specific several years ago, and we covered a lot of topics, but one of the topics that we didn't cover was brain injury, and it was brought to our attention through leadership here at OSEP that perhaps we need to have a webinar around brain injury, since that's often one of the most misunderstood of the disabilities, and that would build the parent center's staff capacity around brain injury. And the Brain Injury Association of America was particularly interested in reaching out to parent centers to starting new kinds of collaborations and partnerships around brain injury and bringing their information to parent centers. They actually did a kind of a dry run, so to speak, or a pilot webinar for the PTI in Central Florida, and they got to learn a lot about what the parent centers in Florida, that parent center with their staff knew about brain injury, and can figure out how to tailor-make this webinar to meet the needs of the parent center staff, who are oftentimes very, very knowledgeable about a whole range of disabilities. So that's really the intent of this webinar, and it is a way, again, to know more about the resources that are available and ways of forming partnerships across a lot of groups that work in disabilities, and that can be helpful to our families as we refer people to resources in the community. So with that, I'll turn it back to Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. And I want to let everyone know that we are now joined by Brenda Eagan Brown, and she's going to share her screen with a presentation for us. And so while she's doing that, let me introduce her. Brenda is the statewide program coordinator for Pennsylvania's Brain Injury School Reentry Consulting Program, which is called Brain Steps. Steps is strategies, teaching, educators, parents, and students. This initiative is funded by Pennsylvania's Departments of Health and Education, and that's through the Bureau of Special Education and Education. And it is implemented by the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania. Brenda received her master's from George Washington University in Transitional Special Education with a focus on traumatic brain injury. She's a certified brain injury specialist, and she serves on a number of state, national, and international advisory boards, including the Brain Injury Task Force, the National Collaborative Regarding Children with Brain Injury, and the International Board of Directors for the Sarah Jane Brain Foundation. She's well published, and she regularly presents at conferences, she's received a number of awards. I think it should be noted that Mrs. Eagan Brown was invited by the Centers for Disease Control to serve on an expert panel regarding concussion in schools in Atlanta, and also she was chosen to present for President Obama in the appointed Institute of Medicine National Research Council's committee, which is compiling a comprehensive federal report regarding youth concussions that we hope will guide federal and state agencies and their policies. She spearheaded work with the Pennsylvania Department of Education to create statewide concussion materials for educators, including a return to school and academics protocol. And Mrs. Eagan Brown also recently developed and implemented the Return to School Concussion Management Team Model Project, which has established and trained over 670 school-based concussion teams in Pennsylvania over the past year. Brenda, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I am just going to get my PowerPoint up. Okay, Deborah, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, it's coming across very nicely. It's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great. Now, I cannot see any questions or anything coming through when I'm sharing my desktop. So we're going to save questions till the end, and I'm going to get started. So I'm really happy to be here today. As Deborah said, traumatic brain injury is so important in the lives of the students who have traumatic brain injury. And it's vital that people who are working with these students have a really firm understanding of not just how these students function in the classroom, but other things also, such as how traumatic brain injury is different in students compared to other disabilities. So, as Deborah said, I am the program coordinator for the Brain Steps program in the state of Pennsylvania. If anyone has any questions after this that we don't get to, or if you think, in a few days of some more questions, you can always go to our website right here, brainsteps.net, and get a hold of me. Also, the Brain Steps program in Pennsylvania was started in 2007 by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. It's jointly funded by the Pennsylvania Department of Health and the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Bureau of Special Education. And it's been implemented for the we're starting our 8th year, by the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania. So all three entities work together to implement the Brain Steps program, which is a brain injury school reentry program for students who have brain injuries in the state of Pennsylvania. So today we're going to cover how TBI is different than other disabilities. We're going to talk about educational safeguards and also strategies to facilitate student learning after sustaining a traumatic brain injury. I have heard many, many, many quotes from teachers. So I compiled some of them for you that are very, very commonly heard when teachers don't have a firm understanding of what traumatic brain injury actually is and how it can manifest in students. So I put some of the quotes here for you, and I want to go through them now. One quote was, his brain injury happened when he was 2. He's 12 now. His behaviors are due to bad parenting, not a TBI. And we're going to debunk that myth in a few minutes. He's using his brain injury as an excuse to get out of doing schoolwork. She doesn't look brain injured. Well, that would be because it's called the silent epidemic. And a lot of students after brain injury, the great majority, don't look like they have a brain injury. It's silent. She is acting out just to spite me. The big one we always hear is the brain injury should be healed by now. We're also going to debunk this myth and talk about why, when a student seems like they have recovered completely, maybe in some cases, other issues could show up on down the road. He was disruptive before his brain injury. Nothing has changed. The TBI didn't cause this. Now, nationwide, students who sustain TBIs of all severities are often underidentified and misidentified in schools for many, many reasons. It is so crucial when you're working with parents, you want them to understand so that the school hopefully will then understand that if that student needs something like special education and they've had a prior traumatic brain injury that's resulting now in issues that student may be having that is requiring them to have special education, they need to be labeled correctly on their special education plan, which is an IEP. There are, I think, 13 different categories, different labels. Some students may be labeled as having an emotional disability, others as a learning disability. And we're going to talk about how TBI is its own category. And what happens is, nationwide, many times schools don't know about students who've had a prior brain injury. So when they start to have issues in school, it can look like maybe a learning disability. So if they qualify for special education services, they might list that student as having a learning disability instead of a traumatic brain injury, or needing emotional support instead of a student having behavior issues secondary to a traumatic brain injury. And it's very, very important because we work with students who have traumatic brain injuries differently than we might work with students of other disability categories. Now, it would be easy to identify all students who come back to school after a traumatic brain injury if they had bandages on their head, but we don't see students like this very often. So there are many, many other clues, and you're going to learn about them today, that hopefully you will incorporate and share with parents so that parents can be sure that they know the red flags to look for to notify schools about when their child's had a prior brain injury. So first I want to tell you about some traumatic brain injury statistics. According to the Centers for Disease Control, brain injury is a leading cause of death and disability in children and young adults. But nationwide, again, traumatic brain injury educationally is considered a low-incidence disability. So you can see where the big discrepancy is. If brain injury is a leading cause of disability in children, according to the statistics we have, but yet educationally it's considered low incidence, the discrepancy there is schools don't know about the students that have prior brain injuries, or they may not be identifying the students correctly when they do need special education services. About 500,000 children every year, according to the Centers for Disease Control, are actually hospitalized or have an emergency department visit for a traumatic brain injury. And this includes children ages 0 to 14. The majority of these children will return to school, and they probably will have at least one impact. Now, students who have concussions, which are also can be considered maybe mild traumatic brain injury, these students, when they come back to school, sometimes they might have some cognitive issues, they might have some emotional issues or behavioral issues, and then even the more moderate to severe brain injuries. Sometimes the impacts when the student goes back to school are minimal. Other times they could last for a very, very, very long time. But there are 3 medical severities of traumatic brain injury. And I didn't want to go into all the different types of traumatic brain injuries today, but I did want to be sure that we talked about mild, moderate, and severe traumatic brain injury. Regardless of regardless of what the medical diagnosis is, just because you hear a student has a mild traumatic brain injury or a concussion, that does not mean that functionally when that student comes back to school, they're going to be okay. The majority, yes, they probably will be, but not always. We have had students in our program who were diagnosed with concussions, never experienced any loss of consciousness, and they were faring much worse in school than a student that had been in a coma for 1 to 2 days. So you really, you have to take each case individually, And the severe students tend to get rehabilitation, students with severe traumatic brain injuries. And so those students are pretty easily identified because they're coming out of rehab facilities. With all of the concussion clinics across the United States, mild traumatic brain injuries, concussions, they are really starting to ramp up how many are being identified. And I could spend 2 whole days with you just talking about concussion management. But I also want to make sure we focus today on the moderate traumatic brain injuries. These are the students that are falling through the cracks. These are the students that you're probably going to be getting phone calls about from parents where the students are, maybe they were hospitalized for a few days and then they were discharged home rather than going to rehab. And the injury may not really manifest in these students sometimes until on down the road. So we can never be too sure. That's why it's always important to ask the questions. Schools should be asking, you know, has your child sustained a brain injury? Has your child ever been seen in the emergency department with a traumatic brain injury? Has your child ever been in a car accident? So lots of different ways the questions can be asked to screen out students. Now, a child's brain is not like an adult's brain. A child's brain is not fully developed until around the early to mid-20s. This is a graph I love to show. It's by Dr. Sandra Chapman at the University of Texas. And she shows the normal development trajectory of a child. It tends to go up over time. Now here in red, she has superimposed the impact of a traumatic brain injury occurring. And as you can see, there's a dip down, and then it starts to go back up. But as you can see, that student that's signified by the red graph never completely gets back to that developmental trajectory that the other students may have been on. Now, this isn't true for all students after traumatic brain injury, but it is true for a lot of them. And some of them, when they first come back to school, may seem like they're really, really starting to keep up. And then over time, and this is over the next few years, we can see something occur that she has coined as neurocognitive stall. And if you look here at the yellow circle, if students are supported and families, when the injury happens, by people who really understand brain injury and can connect that family with resources and can make sure the school's aware the student has had a brain injury, then over time, we can serve as a safety net for these students, because the best example I can give you of a neurocognitive stall or an issue manifesting years later after a prior brain injury would be our frontal lobes, which are in the front of our brain, are the largest lobe of the brain. They are in charge of our higher order thinking skills. And if you are 6 years old, you aren't using your higher order thinking skills yet, because those skills really don't mature and develop until around middle school age. So if you're 6 years old in the first grade and you hit your head on a windshield during a car accident, injuring your frontal lobe, maybe it's summertime, the student could maybe be in the hospital a few days and then be discharged home. The student goes back to school. The student very well could seem like nothing is the matter. The school may have no idea. The parents may not know to let the school, be informed about this prior car accident because their child seems fine. So during those first few years, elementary school teachers developmentally, knowing that executive functions are really not called upon until the middle school years, they serve as a child's frontal lobes, the teachers. They tell them exactly what to do, where to stand, what book to pull out, what time to do this, what time to do that. So they're functioning as their frontal lobe. So if there was injury to the frontal lobe, it may not manifest until that student is in middle school and the higher order thinking skills are now being called upon. Students are expected to be more independent in middle school. They have to be more organized in middle school. And all of that is housed, the majority, in the frontal lobe. So this can be when we see a prior injury manifest. And that is so crucial for students who have brain injury. Just because they seem like they're doing okay one year, that doesn't mean it's going to be consistent through graduation. So we always need to make sure we're checking in. Is the educational program appropriate for the student? This is a little vignette, and this is a true story of a student. Riley, 8 years old, was on vacation with her parents. While traveling down the highway in their RV one night, she woke up disoriented, walked to what she thought was the bathroom, opened the door, and fell out onto the highway. She was in the hospital for 1 month and then transferred to rehab, where she remained for 6 months. When Riley returned to school, she seemed to be doing okay with appropriate supports in place, but over the next 2 years, the teacher saw her developmental momentum in comparison with her peers begin to stall. Her knowledge base was also extremely scattered. Some days her teacher reported she could do things like multiply 38 times 12 in her head, but then the next minute she couldn't remember how to add 10 plus 12. And for those of you that have been in the teaching profession, you can imagine how frustrating that can be for a teacher who's trying to gauge a student's learning, their new learning, and how much they've retained. And that's one of the reasons why students with traumatic brain injury can be tricky. So how exactly are students who sustain traumatic brain injuries different from students who have other types of disabilities? Well, first, students who have traumatic brain injury were not born this way. A traumatic brain injury is always a brain injury that has occurred after birth. So there is a sudden onset of a disability. There are sudden ongoing medical needs. Even if it's a concussion, if that concussion doesn't resolve in the first few weeks, that student will probably go to a physiatrist or a neurologist or a concussion clinic and have some ongoing medical needs. There is a sudden disruption of prior normal brain development in many cases and the potential manifestation of new issues over the years. Sudden loss of peer relationships. This is such a big one after brain injury. These are students who usually, if there's been a car accident and they're in the rehabilitation or in the hospital in acute care, the school rallies around, kids are making cards, they make signs when the student comes out of the hospital or rehab. Everyone's rallying. And then over time, if that student has some residual effects from their brain injury, sometimes the peer relationships start to fall away. And the hardest thing about working, I believe, with students who have traumatic brain injury is that their prior memories remain intact, which is a good thing. It's their future capability for learning that's impacted. But at the same time, even though that's a good thing, these are students after their brain injury who remember who they used to be. They remember who their friends were. There's also a potential lack of self-awareness of new injury-imposed deficits. This is classic for many, many people who have traumatic brain injury. They have this lack of self-awareness of their new deficits. And this is what I just talked about. Prior memory tends to remain intact, but it's the future learning of that student that's impacted. This is why younger children, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, this is why they tend to fare worse after a traumatic brain injury than someone who's my age. Because I have already gone through college, I've had all my life experiences. So if I sustained a traumatic brain injury at my age right now, I have all of that prior knowledge to fall back on. So I might do, a little better than a 2-year-old who has a severe traumatic brain injury and hasn't gone through school, doesn't have that prior learning to fall back on. So now that child will be doing all of their future learning on a brain that has been impacted because of injury. Also, traumatic brain injury, like we just talked about in a little vignette of Riley, these students many times have more extreme discrepancies among their abilities and uneven and unpredictable progress. Some people refer to it in the field as the Swiss cheese effect, where sometimes the student knows an answer and other times they either can't recall it or it's on the tip of their tongue. So it's really important we give students time, give them time to answer. They may have slow processing speed or memory issues. After traumatic brain injury, many, many students return to school and they don't look like they've had a brain injury. There's a reconciliation of old self with new self. And this is hard because the older you are when you have a brain injury, the more sense of self you have. There was a student that we had in our program, Brain Steps, who was struck by lightning when he was 12 years old. He was an all-star baseball player. Grades came very easily to him. He would get all A's and B's. He was struck by lightning, sustained an acquired brain injury because his heart stopped, and that cut off oxygen to his brain. And he went back to school after going through rehabilitation, and he was now in a special education self-contained class. He remembered who his friends used to be. He remembered how easily he used to learn. And so not only do we work with these students to help them with their new ways of learning, to come up with strategies, but we also have to be very, very sensitive to the students and help them work through the feelings of reconciling who they used to be with who they are now. So counseling is so effective. And not only that, but we have to think about the parents, because these are parents who have actually gone through, every parent's worst nightmare many times. And when their child was born, you have goals and dreams for your child, and now all of those goals and dreams may have to be, rethought. So that's another thing. You just want to be really, really sensitive. Also, rapid gains tend to occur the first 1 to 2 years after brain injury. So initial goals or objectives that the school may set will probably quickly become pretty obsolete. So someone should always be frequently updating any goals for that student, always monitoring to see if the educational program is appropriate. Now, we had students through the brain injury program write down in an activity through one of our team support groups what my brain injury means to me, and I just wanted to share that with you. This student said, I remember getting good grades and how easy it used to be for me. My mom treats me like a baby. It's harder to complete my work. I can't wear flip-flops anymore. This was a big deal. This was a teenage girl who could not wear flip-flops anymore to school, which to us as adults, that may not seem like a big deal, but to a teenage girl, as soon as that sun comes out and winter goes away, it's very important to wear flip-flops. But this student had hemiparesis, so one side of her body was weaker than the other, and she was unable to wear them anymore after her brain injury. I can't use the hand I used to write with. I don't have any friends. I remember how easy school used to be for me. I remember who my friends were. I remember who I used to be. I remember not needing special education. I just wanted to say a word about homebound. It's so important whether a student has any severity of traumatic brain injury. The best place for that student after they're coming out of the hospital or home or rehab is to get back in school. Socially, emotionally, academically. For instance, concussions, they're now saying about 3 to 5 days after a concussion, a student should be home on cognitive and physical rest. After that, the student really needs to be back in school. But the caveat to that is the school needs to be prepared for all of these students, not all of these students, but all the different severities of traumatic brain injury, so that they can have accommodations in place to keep facilitating learning for that student while a student is still recovering. Because as I said earlier, the first 1 to 2 years, these students with more moderate to severe brain injuries, they're going to have rapid recoupment of who they used to be and how they used to be in the classroom many times. So they may seem like they're really, really, doing really well for the first 2 years at times. They could have rapid gains, and then they may plateau a little bit. It's very different for every student, very different. But we definitely want the students back in school as soon as possible, because now students aren't staying in rehabilitation facilities for months and months like they used to, 15, 20 years ago. Now they're in for very short periods of time. So the school essentially is functioning as that rehabilitation for the student. So getting them back into their schedules, keeping them on task, keeping them on a schedule, that is helping them rehabilitate. And something is usually missing if a student isn't back at school, whether it's a return to school plan, whether it's accommodations. Maybe the staff wasn't trained in traumatic brain injury to really understand it. And there has to be fluid, consistent communication between home, school, medical, and rehab. All the parties involved should really be fluidly communicating, not just during transition periods, like leaving hospital to rehab or rehab to school. It should be a fluid communication the whole way around. So homebound, we really want to try to keep kids off of homebound if we can. Now I wanted to touch on some educational law for you so that you can help parents, navigate this process after a student's had a traumatic brain injury. A student after a TBI may not need any services, and the way I approach it is when a student comes back to school, again, that first year or two, they're going to have rapid gains. So I really like to see the school, A, be completely trained and have a good understanding of traumatic brain injury, have a good understanding of that student's needs, their strengths, and their weaknesses now. And then I like the school to front load these students with support. Front load them with academic accommodations, and then over time pull back, see how the student's doing as they are making some gains. Because you never know how a student's going to do over time. So front load with support. Many students might need a 504, a Section 504 plan, which is not special education. And a smaller number may need an IEP, which is considered special education. Let's talk about special education. Under the federal definition, traumatic brain injury was added into the special education law, IDEA, back in the early 1990s as a specific category requiring specialized understanding. And actually, a bit of trivia, traumatic brain injury was added the same year that autism was added to the special education law as a classification for a category for special education. And the federal special ed law, now I know we have people here from all the different states. Each state has their own, whether they follow the federal definition, which is what Pennsylvania follows, and I'm going to talk about the federal definition today. But you really want to check with your Department of Education to see, because there are some states, like Colorado, and I can't think of the rest off the top of my head, who have, I'm not even sure if Colorado has, I'm sorry. I'm not sure which states, but they have actually added, they've done away with TBI as a label, and they call it ABI, so acquired brain injury. We're going to talk about today the federal definition, and the definition is TBI is an acquired injury to the brain caused by an external physical force resulting in total or partial functional disability or psychosocial impairment or both that adversely affects a child's educational performance. That is the federal definition. The term applies to open or closed head injuries. An open head injury is when the skull has been fractured, or when a bullet, penetrates, or any time the skull is fractured. A closed head injury, it's very common with falls. It's when the brain, sits inside of a bony skull, and if my fist is the brain and I hit a windshield, my brain is going to go back and forth inside of my skull and shear neurons. That's a closed head injury. So the skull isn't opened. Instead, the brain injury occurs like a concussion bouncing inside the skull. And it results in an impairment in one or more of these areas that are bulleted. So it's key. If a student is thought to need special education, the school will look at these different types of areas to see, okay, the student has, a medical diagnosis of a traumatic brain injury or parent reporting of a prior traumatic brain injury. And then do they have a difference in how they were functioning before the injury? So what was that student's baseline maybe in 7th grade? Let's look at their educational records compared to now in 8th grade after they had a traumatic brain injury. And they really can go back and look at the records and can compare them. And then there's also many different tests that school psychologists or neuropsychologists that maybe the school hires or the parents hire for an independent evaluation. A neuropsychologist tests students' cognitive processes. So they are like experts in brain-based learning. But school psychologists also have really good grips now on different tests to use to help identify, students' areas of weakness and strengths after a brain injury. Now, this is important. The TBI definition does not apply for special education purposes to brain injuries that are congenital, degenerative, or induced by birth trauma. Also, the federal definition for special ed under TBI does not include brain injuries caused by other internal conditions such as stroke, brain infection, tumor, anoxia, or exposure to toxic substances. That does not mean that a student won't qualify for special education if they need it. This just means if a student qualifies for special education and they have a traumatic brain injury under the definition, they can then be classified as having their primary exceptionality being traumatic brain injury. But other students can still have special education services if they qualify under a different special ed classification. It gets a little confusing, but you all have these slides and you can go back and refer to them. So I put this little chart here. Traumatic brain injury is an open head injury, a closed head injury, or a near drowning. Near drowning is in the regulations as being a brain injury that is caused by the external physical force of the water. But yet, other health impaired is also a special education classification, OHI. So students that have any type of brain injury that is not traumatic, but is non-traumatic, like strokes, brain tumors, brain infections, lightning strikes, these students fall under other health impaired rather than TBI. But the near drowning, that's a little caveat. We talked about that, and that is also what I just talked about, the near drowning. What happens in a near drowning is there's lack of oxygen to the brain, the heart stops, lack of oxygen to the brain. If you don't have oxygen going to the brain, your neurons survive with oxygen. So they will start dying if you're without oxygen for a period of so many minutes. That is that. I also wanted to touch on IEPs. So if you're a student that needs special education, then you would have an individualized an IEP, a plan for your programming, your educational programming. After brain injury, I know a lot of times, students' IEPs will be reviewed once a year. But after a brain injury, remember that first 1 to 2 years, students are making rapid gains, so it would not make sense to only review that IEP every May. Instead, for the first 1 to 2 years, you really want to review or have someone take a look at that IEP and those goals to see every 3 months, are they still appropriate for the student? That's crucial. Also, the first 1 to 2 years back, we really highly encourage the school to offer extended school year services to the students. And that is because when they're making those rapid gains, we don't want them off for 2.5 months for summer break. The scheduling, consistency is key to helping these students with their cognitive processing. And then also I was trying to think what would really help states understand, what they can do better for students who have brain injuries. So we got the idea years ago from Oregon, who has also a school reentry TBI program, and that's who Pennsylvania's Brain Steps program is based off of, Oregon's program. But their program coordinator created a guided IEP for Oregon. So in Pennsylvania, we created a guided IEP for students with traumatic brain injury. I've shared this with you in the resources section. So anytime you have a parent that may be going to an IEP meeting and they contact you and they say, I need help. How do I know what's appropriate? This can walk through that parent or that IEP team with key questions to ask. I know this is a Pennsylvania IEP form. Many, they're all based on basically the same ideas. You have goals, you have present levels of performance. So please check that out in the resources section. And this is, one of the examples. So when we're talking about is the student blind or visually impaired? Well, we put a little yellow box here that says many students after TBI may have vision difficulties, and we list out some different things that the IEP team should really take into consideration. Some students should be seen by, a pediatric ophthalmologist, because there are many, 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 many different types of vision impacts, even after concussion, the whole way up through more severe injuries. One eye could be off a few degrees. There could be convergence issues. So lots of different things to think about. But as you can see, I won't spend any more time on that, but I hope you share it with parents. Now, Section 504 plans. As I said, 504 plans are not special education, but they are educational safeguards that are available under the law for students who qualify. A 504 plan is a person with a disability who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits, and that's key here, the word substantially, has to limit one or more major life activities, have a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. So if you have a student with a traumatic brain injury, a student with a concussion, either of those, if it substantially limits one or more of these activities. So seeing, hearing, walking, and I starred some that denote common concussion impacts. Learning, breathing, reading, thinking, concentrating, sleeping, eating, bowel functions, bladder functions, digestive functions. So there are 13 different major life activities, and it's up to the school team to make a decision based on how that is impacting, that disability is impacting one of these. If it's substantial enough, then they will create an accommodation plan for that student. Again, it's not special education. It's accommodations to make the learning, to make it even with students who don't have these types of impairments. It levels the playing field. That's the word I was looking for. This is a recent journal article I wanted to share with you. I can put it in the resources. I will send it. I didn't send it yet. But it's K-12 Students with Concussions, a Legal Perspective. And it talks all about the importance of using either IEPs, which are health plans, individual health plans with students after concussion or any type of brain injury, and also 504 plans and IEPs. Now, there are some effective instructional practices, but brain injury, even though it's so prevalent, there has not been a lot of research in the field of what are effective educational practices. There has been some. So a lot of it is, trial and error. A lot of it is we figure out if the student's having attention issues, what works for other disability populations, what types of instructional practices work with students who have ADHD maybe, and we try to employ them here. But we're going to talk about some that are known to be effective. So first, when you have a student coming back to the classroom, relay to the teacher that classroom roles are clearly displayed for the student. These are just good teacher practices. So most teachers nowadays will post classroom roles. But for a student with a traumatic brain injury, repetition is key. So those roles should not just be posted and reviewed on the board. They should also be on the student's desk, maybe in the student's binder, and they have to be reviewed, because we want the students to become consistent. Another effective instructional practice are agendas, routines, and schedules. They should be clearly defined and, again, posted in the classroom. Now, for the student with a TBI, just like we just said with the classroom rules, it should be posted on their desk, It could be posted in a planner. It could be on an index card. These serve as cueing mechanisms for the students. And it's so important that we not just give students instructional practices or accommodations to use, but we actually instruct the student on how to use them. This is a good visual schedule for a student that had a brain injury. So as you can see, this student needed a pretty detailed morning and afternoon schedule. Arrive on bus at 8:50, go to the cafeteria. And then English, room 2, because a lot of students have memory issues. So this tells what room to go to, what time. When you get there, you have your English book, you turn in your homework, you write your homework in your planner. These serve as effective cueing mechanisms for students after brain injury. The more that we can set the environment up for these students to succeed by using things like visual schedules for them, the more that they are going to succeed. Also, you want to think about schedules at home. We hear a lot of times parents will say that their child comes home, they held it together all day in school, they come home, they're cognitively fatigued because their brain is overloaded. And when they get home, they have behavioral outbursts or they explode. So try to be consistent. What they're doing at school, if they're using schedules, create a schedule at home. Be consistent with that schedule. And this is an at-home schedule that we use for a student, and it really, really helps. Also, classroom organization and structure allow for smooth transitions between groups and activities and all-day learning. And for the student with a traumatic brain injury, let's think about this. What is the best type of classroom environment? Many times after a brain injury, when a student's reentering back into school and we're having a meeting with the school district, the parents say, we want Mr. Collenberg, who is the best teacher at that school. Well, typically, think about the best teachers in first grade. They're the ones that all the parents see as being the one with all the different room sections where games are going on. There's some light music playing in the background. There is complete environmental words everywhere. Everything is labeled, very colorful, very busy. Sometimes these are not the best classroom environments for students after brain injury because many, many, many times when they come back to school after more moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries, they could be very easily overstimulated by too much environmental stimulation. So a lot of times, you know, and again, it depends on the student, but for these students, we like to have them in classrooms that have minimal environmental stimulation. We like to have them with teachers that are consistent every day. The schedule's posted. That teacher doesn't sway from her schedule. That teacher doesn't have a substitute in very much. That teacher is routine-based. That is so important. And then effective instructional strategies are also where before we teach something to a student, we make sure that we pre-teach. So the prerequisite skills are mastered before continuing, whether it's teaching them vocabulary, connecting the information to prior learning, so the students can say, oh, yeah, I remember learning that before. That's going to help solidify this in their mind to build upon. And what we know is that for the student with a traumatic brain injury, direct instruction is a technique for teaching that is very beneficial. It's an instructional strategy, and some of you may be familiar with it. There is a curriculum. There's several different curriculums that are based on direct instruction, but a very common one that schools use is the SRA reading or SRA math. Those are direct instruction and tend to be very helpful after brain injury because they're very predictable. Also, teachers that are good teachers for all students, they tend to give time provided for corrective feedback and error correction. And for the student with a traumatic brain injury, one technique that tends to work is called errorless learning. And I'm sure that's a new idea for many people. A lot of people haven't heard of errorless learning, but please jot down a note to Google that, because errorless learning essentially doesn't let the student have a chance while they're learning content to make a mistake. because there's something about making mistakes after a traumatic brain injury where the mistakes stick in the kid's brain. So airless learning can be really, really helpful. It's a good strategy to try. Also, cue cards. Anytime, again, these students are going to have cognitive fatigue. Their brain is still trying to recover as much as it can. And so anything we can do to alleviate their mind or their brain, which should just be spending all of its effort recovering, we want to try to help do. So cue cards, multiple choice, word banks, those are much less cognitively demanding for students because I always tell teachers this and parents, after a brain injury, I'm not as interested in the process that a student uses to get to an answer. I want to know if they know the right answer. Therefore, I'm not going to give a student a unit test after a traumatic brain injury and say, find these answers. I would probably give maybe a word bank or multiple choice, or there's lots of different ways that you can put the answers in front of a student to have them identify the correct answer. So there's lots of them, and again, that would be another whole day training to talk about that. But there's lots of cue cards that you can help students guide them. So this student was having trouble doing independent seat work after a lesson. So we came up with a cue card, and this student, every time they became a little off task, whenever they were supposed to be doing independent seat work, the teacher would tap the student on the shoulder, and the student would look down. That was the cue to read their cue card. And this one said, read the directions, try the first one on your own. And it took the students step by step through the process of independent seat work. And over time, students internalize these. Same with math. You can use cue cards for everything. Now this is a script. Scripts are very, very powerful. Kelly sustained a severe TBI when she was in a car accident. After months at rehab, she returned to school. Our Brain Steps program worked with her teachers and found that task analysis and social scripts were very beneficial for her new learning. But the following summer, her father passed away. He was her only living parent. She was extremely anxious about going back to school in the fall for fear of questions that she would be asked. So she had a lot of anxiety. So her Brain Steps team worked with her on a script, and this really helped alleviate her anxiety. So they worked on this. She had this index card. She carried it with her to remind her in case she started to forget. But they reviewed this with her until she internalized what to say. So they would role play. Hi, Kelly, I heard something happened to your dad. Or maybe a student might say, Kelly, did your dad die? And Kelly was prepared, and it alleviated her anxiety because she knew what to say. My dad was in a car accident. He passed away. I'm still really sad. Thanks for asking. Scripts need to be distributed practice, repeated, embedded in meaningful activity, and used across everyday partners. This is from Mark Yelvisacker and Tim Feeney. They are also awesome experts in this field. If you want to Google them, you can find more information about them. But after brain injury, we want students to self-regulate. Self-regulate is internalized self-talk. And these are some of my favorites I wanted to share with you. For a lot of students who have trouble getting started on a project, we do goal, plan, do, review. And we teach students over and over to say this, goal, plan, do, review, goal, plan, do, review. So first they set a goal, then they work out a plan, then they do it, and then we come back together and we review it. This can be used for long-term projects. It can be used for short-term homework. It can be used for lots of different things, but it really is helpful. That's one script. And these are also other favorite scripts that I like. And these are good for students that, not just with traumatic brain injury, but with all disabilities. Every student can benefit from self-regulation scripts. So what these are a hard, easy, big deal, little deal, ready, not ready, scary, not scary. And I'm going to show you how we use these. Hard to do, easy to do. Ready, not ready. Big deal, little deal. So for this student, everything to this student was a big deal. Everything was a big deal. So we sat down with the student and we said, okay, let's talk about what is a really big deal, what really, really upsets you. And this student said someone punching, hitting, or kicking him, someone swearing at him, someone touching papers on his desk. So then we said, okay, now what's a little deal, something that doesn't upset you that much? What would a little deal be? And the student said, well, my pencil falling on the floor, not liking the girl sitting next to him, wanting to eat a snack, and the pencil lead breaking. Those were little deals. So now moving forward, every time the student started to get upset about something, the teacher would say, is this a big deal or a little deal? Big deal or little deal? And the student then, over time, and it's not always fast, but over time, the student, before getting upset, started to think to himself, is this a big deal or a little deal? And he could kind of rate it based on what he now knows a big deal is and what a little deal is. If it's a little deal, you don't worry about it and you try to move on. Another one that we use is scary, not scary. This student, after brain injury, when they came back to the classroom, everything frightened the student. So we talked about what's scary to you. And this student said mean dogs, the principal, the spiders, getting yelled at, talking in front of the class, and substitute teachers. So then we said, okay, what's not scary? Well, talking to friends, nice dogs, caterpillars, when the teacher's smiling, my house, my mom and dad. So from this point forward, we said, okay, scary, not scary. Anytime the student started to get really worked up and upset about something, we would regroup by saying, okay, Joey, is this scary or not scary? And then he would start to internalize this self-talk. Now, I know we're running out of time, so to wrap things up, it's important after brain injury, parents, yes.
I think people are going to have questions, and we have about 3 minutes left in the presentation.
Okay.
So we will have all of the slides available for everyone, and there's some great resources included. But I think it would be good if we could take a few questions now. Is that okay, Brenda?
Oh, sure. That's fine. Yeah.
So if you have a question, you can unmute your line, hit *6, and that'll help you to be able to ask your question on orally, or you can type it into the chat box. And I actually have a question of the parent centers that are on the call. If you have any suggestions that you want to share with your colleagues about ways that you've worked with families with children who have suffered a traumatic brain injury, I think it would be great to hear from you if you have anything that you'd like to share from your work. Kathy is typing. Does someone have a question? This is a quiet group. So there's a question from Kathy Harstad. Do you have information and resources that are helpful to high school teachers in working with these populations? Brenda?
Yeah, we actually, because we work with students kindergarten through 12th grade, so we have lots of different resources. If you send me an email, I can send you lots of different links also. There are links at the end of my PowerPoint presentation online, and they are great sites like Project LearnNet out of New York, and CBIRT, which is in Oregon, CBIRT. One of my last slides, and there are a lot of great information on there for high schools.
Deborah? Kelly Henderson has a question. Have you had a specific experience or know of data related to the impact of TBI on children who have experienced abuse? Any differences in approaches for this group? That's a great question, Kelly.
It is, and we do work with students that have things such as shaken baby syndrome whenever they were younger, or even children that are in crisis shelters from being beaten, and they've sustained traumatic brain injuries, even whether of any severity. When we work with students with concussion or any severity of brain injury, a brain injury is a brain injury, but they all manifest differently. So we always make sure, some of these students have dual diagnoses coming in of PTSD and traumatic brain injury. So we're really sensitive to helping connect them with counselors who can help, and just keeping that PTSD, knowing that that's there also, working with the schools around that.
Oh, she's home already.
Deborah?
Yes,
We have a question from Leah. Any resources to help families whose children have autism and who headbang? And she put in quotes, significant.
No, we have gotten that question before, and I am not familiar with any materials on that. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful with that, but it does occur. It can cause brain injuries, obviously, if they're banging their head. So just forming some sort of team around this child to try to alleviate them banging their head, although I know that that's really difficult to do 24 hours a day.
Deborah, this is Carmen. I saw a question from Jill Klein that I'm not sure you've asked yet, which is there a time of day that is more difficult for kids to learn and absorb who have traumatic brain injury?
That's a good question. So is there a time of day? No, there's no set time of day. We always look at how does the student's sleep function. A lot of times after a more severe traumatic brain injury, many students become almost nocturnal, where they want to sleep all day and they're up all night. So for those students, we would always recommend that whenever they start back to school, their core classes, if they can go half day in the afternoon, put their core classes in the afternoon. Other students, mornings tend to work better because you want to alleviate their cognitive fatigue. So you don't want to have the hard classes for some students in the afternoon because they'll be too tired, so you want to front load those in the morning. Very individualized to the student.
Also, there's a question, do you have any data or resources about being nocturnal after traumatic brain injury?
No, I don't have any. If you send me an email, I do have some things on fatigue, not specifically to nocturnal, but a lot on the fatigue that persists after brain injury. It's very common, and it's very common that it might last the rest of their life because their brain has to actually, a lot of times, work harder to learn the same information that we may be able to learn without a brain injury easier. I see a question. Do you have any peer-to-peer approaches? Well, what we've done in Pennsylvania is nothing formalized for the peer-to-peer, but we have 30 BrainSteps teams across the state that work. When students are having peer issues after traumatic brain injury, we kind of try to form a peer circle of support where we'll pull in key student leaders that are willing to help out and facilitate friendships with the student. But we were just talking about this yesterday. It may work during the school day, but it's so hard to keep facilitating those friendships outside of the classroom environment. And so just building up students and peers, their understanding of brain injury so that they're more empathetic to their friends rather than just not being aware of the differences in students who have brain injuries and what it means for their friends. So definitely, we do a lot of peer education with parent permission, of course.
Kathy also shared a website, worrywise.com, W-O-R-R-Y, worry, wise, W-I-S-E.com. Do I see any other questions? We're at just over 5 minutes after the hour, and we know that we promised that this will be a 1-hour webinar. If you do have other questions, feel free to keep chatting away in the chat box, and we'll keep answering them. But in the meantime, do take a minute to complete our evaluation survey. The link is in the chat box. It's also on the screen. And we look forward to your joining us on September the 4th, where we will have a discussion on the alternate assessments for college and career-ready standards and Common Core standards. And so we're hoping that you'll be able to join us for that webinar as well. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and do continue to post your questions.
Deborah, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Lisa. I just wanted to say, Brenda, thank you so much for the great work you do in this area. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. It's been very, very informative.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to hear that.
Yes, thank you, Brenda.
Okay.
And thank you, Nolan and Elaine, for doing a great job with our technology for us today. And we will see everyone next month. It looks like I don't see any more questions. Okay. Angela's time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.